Hey there guys, so recently I went to go pick up a graphics card from a seller on Facebook Marketplace, and while I was chatting with them, they pretty much brought up the fact they had some PC parts laying around that they just didn't care for anymore, and they kind of just wanted to get rid of them. So they asked me if I wanted them. So I ended up taking up their offer, and it was essentially this CPU right here, a Ryzen 3 3100 and 8GB of low-speed DDR4 RAM. Now I don't have much of a use for that RAM really, it is just extremely slow and such a low capacity. But this Ryzen 3 is actually very interesting. This is a 4-core 8-thread part originally released all the way back in April of 2020. And because this is a Ryzen 3000 series that isn't an APU, that means that this is on Zen 2. In other words, the first process node that AMD used when they transitioned away from Global Foundries to TSMC. This was the moment where AMD really started to close the performance gap with Intel. Because with Zen 1 and Zen Plus, the performance of each individual core just was not there in comparison to what Intel had at the time. So when this dropped, and I mean this as in the architecture, that's when AMD really had a massive leap. And I'm curious how this 4-core 8-thread part has held up all the way in the year of 2025. You know, the Ryzen 3 line in general seems to have died off, with AMD taking more of an approach of using older generation parts to fill out the lower end of the product stack instead of bothering to produce something low end like this. So I'm curious where this even stands in the year of 2025. Now luckily I do have an AM4 motherboard laying around. I didn't even know this, but I have a Ryzen 7 5700X in that thing. So I think that's actually going to be a pretty fun comparison to see how that 5700X performs in comparison to this. Now the GPU that I'm going to be using is going to be an RTX 2070 Super. It's not the graphics card that I picked up used, but that graphics card I'm saving for its own dedicated video. So we're just going to use the 2070 Super because that's really what I have on hand that I could pair with this. So to start things off, I want to take a look at Mount & Blade 2 Bannerlord, a game that tends to be pretty forgiving on most systems, and well, the result here is pretty interesting. We're running this at 1080p with the maximum in-game graphics settings, and you can see that we're pretty CPU limited. For one, the CPU is seeing about 80 to 90% utilization, so all 4 cores and 8 threads are seeing some heavy utilization, and I cannot say the same thing for the GPU. The GPU is not even seeing 50% utilization most of the time, so we're severely being held back by the CPU in this scenario. And this becomes very apparent when we compare it to the Ryzen 7 5700X on the exact same motherboard. There's a massive uplift in both the 1% lows and the FPS average, and well, more importantly, if you look at that GPU utilization, we're using a lot more of that 2070 Super. It's not locked at 100% all the time, but it's very close to it in comparison to how it is with the Ryzen 3 3100. Moving on to Counter-Strike 2, I ran this with the lowest in-game graphics settings as I felt like that was the best way to put as much of the load onto the CPU as possible, and as you can see, the 3100 is doing a pretty decent result. It's honestly doing better than I was expecting it to. Maybe I just went in with really low expectations for it, but the fact that our FPS average is as high as it is and the 1% lows are as high as they are, it's not that bad of an experience, though you can tell by the frame time charts that the things aren't 100% smooth. That really has a lot more to do with Counter-Strike than anything else. Still, we do get hit with a bit of a reality check when we throw in the 5700X, where the FPS average is significantly higher, the 1% lows see a significant bump, and while the frame time charts do still have little tiny spikes going up, if you actually see what the measurement of those spikes is, it's pretty much just non-existent. And of course, again, we do see significantly higher GPU utilizations, though it's not 100%. The big thing about all of this is the fact that this is all in the same socket. So realistically speaking, if you currently have a 3100, you could just easily upgrade to significantly higher performance, or if you're able to get a 3100 for cheap, and I mean ridiculously cheap as in $10, $20, you could at least later in the future in the same socket upgrade to a pretty significant jump in performance. Now, one game that really surprised me with its level of performance is Rainbow Six Siege X. I did run this with the Ultra Plus graphics settings, so we were putting as much of a load as possible onto the GPU, but in general, the result here was pretty spectacular, where there were a lot of sections where we were pretty much getting the full utilization of our GPU. And if we compare it to the 5700X, the performance difference isn't really all that drastic.
drastic. In fact, the 1% lows did end up being better on the 3100, though not by a significant margin, and the FPS average was higher with the 5700X, but that again doesn't really translate to anything meaningful. If you didn't have an FPS counter up, these would essentially be identical results. So honestly, this was a pretty impressive showing for the 3100. Now, the last game that I took a look at on here, at least for comparison's sake, was Hitman World of Assassination, running with the ultra graphics settings. I did run this with the ultra graphics settings, though I didn't use any kind of ray tracing, and I didn't use DLSS. So this is a pretty GPU demanding workload, but you'll find that a lot of the times the GPU is not really seeing a whole lot of utilization, and the CPU is seeing some crazy utilization whenever all these particle effects are happening. Those really start to bring down the FPS average by kind of a significant margin. This becomes pretty apparent when you compare it to the 5700X. The 1% lows and the FPS average see a pretty significant bump, and for the most part, you'll also notice that the CPU utilization is significantly lower. Of course, a game like this isn't going to utilize all 8 cores and threads, and in those heavy particle situations, it's still going to see a pretty big hit, especially in those 1% lows, but the FPS average in general and the recovery time from those major dips is just significantly quicker with the 5700X, which is not really that bad of an uplift when we're considering the fact that, again, this is on the same socket. Now, I did also test out Marvel Rivals with the built-in benchmark, which I didn't even know existed until recently, and I completely forgot to run this on the 5700X, so can't really compare it to it here, but just in general, the 3100 was doing better than I expected in this title. Being an Unreal 5 engine game, I was really expecting this to not perform well at all on here. So the fact that we were able to get a passable enough level of performance without going with the extremely low graphics settings, it's really surprising, honestly. Sure, it's not going to be a high FPS gaming experience, and there will be pretty frequent drops below 60, but in general, you're going to be able to play the game, and that's really pretty impressive considering this is a 4-core 8-thread processor from 5 years ago.
So as you can see, the performance on this free CPU is not half bad, really. Yes, it's holding back our 2070 Super in a lot of titles, but that's kind of to be expected. But from what we are able to see, it has the performance that you would expect out of a Zen 2 processor, and in 2025, that's still not a bad experience considering that we do get the 4 cores and the 8 threads. Realistically speaking though, in the same socket, you can have a pretty massive uplift with getting a relatively cheap CPU like a Ryzen 7 5700X, or if you go with something cheaper like a Ryzen 5 5600. Both of these CPUs you can find on AliExpress for very cheap, to the point where for all intents and purposes, a CPU like this is for the most part irrelevant because the flexibility of AM4 lets you have a pretty massive uplift without having to change too much of your system. Of course, this board that I have here isn't exactly the greatest. Being a B350 board, it's held back significantly by questionable decisions that were made. For example, the RAM isn't able to clock up very high at all. I effectively have to run it at just default speeds. But if I were to pair this with some 2666 or 2933 or even 3000 megahertz RAM, it would be perfectly fine. A realistic pairing for a GPU for this thing is something more like a GTX 1660 Super. So it is holding back the 2070 Super that we have in here. But in general, for a lot of the most popular titles out there, you still can get away with using the CPU. If you want to maximize your savings and just try to hold on to something like this for a little bit longer, you definitely can. See if you can't wait it out until you can find the 5600 for a even cheaper price in about a year or two. But of course, waiting that much longer for these savings might not be worth it. It might just be worthwhile to jump the gun now and get yourself an upgrade, because if it's holding back something like a 2070 Super, the vast majority of modern cards that you get today are going to be held back by a CPU like this. And not to mention a lot more of the limitations of these older platforms. All in all though, for a free CPU, I can't complain too much about this level of performance. I'm not really sure how much these go for nowadays, but I realistically wouldn't want to take one of these for much more than free. I do have enough parts laying around that I might be able to put together a ultra low budget gaming PC, and I might just try to sell that off for a very low price, but we'll have to see about that. As of right now, I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.